Hello.
Our story begins over Ryloth, with the failed first half of the assault to free the Twi'leks and break the blockade over the planet. Ahsoka came back without her entire squad, losing every single soldier in one go. There were other pilots inside the fleet, but very quickly was it determined that using fighters to break the Separatists would be ineffective. As seen by their first assault, having lost one Venator, crippling another, and losing Admiral Yularen to the medical bay, Ahsoka needed to be at her best. Anakin was already positioning all the supplies, extra fighters, troop carriers, transports, and so on into the final Venator. Skywalker's plan consisted of war crimes, ramming one Venator into the unsuspecting captain of the Separatist fleet. Mar Tuk would arrogantly accept Anakin's surrender and then get pulverized by an act of terror. All in good fun and for the betterment of Ryloth. But because Ahsoka lost her squad and her droid, R7A7 had been destroyed in the dogfight gone wrong, Anakin needed her to have some support. Luckily, there was a trooper within their ranks that offered his older model astromech to Ahsoka. C110P was the droid's code sign. He was an angry little lugnut, manufactured years prior by the industrial automation on the Sun. How he ended up with the Grand Army of the Republic was a question no one begged to answer, but he was surrendered by his Y-Wing pilot for Ahsoka's use. She thanked the clone and introduced herself to the C1 unit, named Chopper. Ahsoka didn't have much time for pleasantries. She needed to get on to the assault. They had a limited time window before Masters Windu and Kenobi arrived to lead the ground invasion. Ahsoka, Chopper, Rex, and the other men with the command crew quickly got ready as Master Skywalker took the broken Venator and departed in hyperspace. He was the first phase of the second assault. She needed to be ready with the finishing blow. What Ahsoka concocted wouldn't be much different than her original designs. It consisted of flipping the Venator on its side and using the base of the hull of the carrier to defend itself, before launching a fighter counter, which Chopper would be joining Ahsoka in. The clone pilot wouldn't be a part of this counter anyways. He was being saved for the landing procedure, so everything worked out naturally. Once they arrived over Ryloth, Skywalker's Venator was slamming into Captain Tuck's flagship, and dispersing fleet command to their 4 nutty battle droid commanders. Their previous orders were to destroy the Republic, and with one remaining Venator, they made the counterattack. Ahsoka finally found her groove in the war, and used this comfort to lead her men into the success that would free the people of Ryloth from the CIS blockade. She and Chopper, flying inside her Delta 7 starfighter, would crush through some Vulture droids and aid the Republic with destroying the Separatist fleet. Minutes after, the Republic landing assault would arrive, and Skywalker's division would be sent to one other sector of the planet to deal with more battle droids. By the time Ahsoka tried to give the clone trooper back his droid, he was already deployed. Ahsoka and Anakin had a debriefing with Obi-Wan and Mace, which of course meant that the hero droids to accompany the 2 Jedi were also involved. Windu wanted to give some praise to R2 and Chopper because they at least played a part, no matter how minor or large it was. Once they were done, they also paid Yularen a visit. The Admiral kept his cool, but he was really starting to hate the Jedi. Anakin got under his skin, and Ahsoka had almost killed him with her maneuver. Obviously, this could be chalked up to a 14-year-old struggling in combat, but he didn't give the Jedi a pass that he typically would give to a cadet. Yularen would return to his post. By that point, the trooper that Ahsoka's droid came from was flying over the surface of the planet. He would eventually be shot down and crash outside the Syndulla's home, resulting in his immediate death. Unluckily for Hera Syndulla, Chopper would not be with the clone, leaving her without a future trusted ally. C110P, though, had the benefit of not fearing Y-Wings with his entire being, because that crash would have traumatized him. Chopper, instead, continued to be quiet as an individual. Despite being an older model with a more rambunctious tone, he wasn't with the clones anymore. Chopper was a favorite amongst his squad, hence why the trooper proposed he be given to Ahsoka temporarily. Things just adjusted to where she would have a complete ownership over the droid. R7A7 was found to be completely damaged beyond repair. Ahsoka and Chopper didn't have much time to get acquainted. This didn't mean that Chopper and R2 wouldn't have their own immediate problems. Both astromechs were temperamental, R2 lesser than Chopper, and even though Chop wasn't used to the current chain of command, once the Jedi were gone, he didn't have to pretend like a regular astromech anymore. He called R2 a punk, and R2 had some other choice words for him. It may have not been violent, but verbally they insulted each other consistently. Yularen, who had to fight off a migraine from the concussion he attained, was given another headache. R2 and Chopper kept bashing each other like territorial goats. They were pissed off at both everything and nothing, so using the other to get that out of them turned the bridge of Yularen's flagship into clanking buckets. Yularen almost removed them from the bridge 4 times, but every time he threatened it, they'd pretend to be good, and Chopper would smack R2 in the head, or R2 would zap Chopper in the rear end. The last time that they got a warning, Chopper was caught laughing because he tripped R2, and the blue astromech left an indent on the floor, which caused a trooper to twist his ankle and fall into R2. Of course, Chopper thought that was hilarious. The clone and Yularen didn't. The droids were put into timeout across the room from each other, and no, they didn't stop there. Even though they were droids and technically couldn't make faces, they did the droid equivalent to making faces at each other. This included opening a variety of compartments, flailing their arms, or making noises to see which one of them could make Yularen pop a blood vessel first. This was a contrast to the experience Ahsoka and Anakin were having on the surface. Like with many battles before, Ahsoka was the calming presence for many troopers before they died or were taken to intense medical bays. This led to an argument between master and apprentice, but it would further Ahsoka's development as a Jedi Padawan, something that would be integral for her continued success throughout the war. Anakin was a difficult instructor, but he did it so that she could survive, and that's what he enforced here on Ryloth. He gave her the option of a fun master or the individual who didn't have a personality. This was war. He needed something to keep himself collected too. She needed to understand that, or he would change himself to fix it. After the recapture of the planet, she would learn that Chopper's master had died during the battle, and she'd be taking complete control over the droid from here on out. Ahsoka was perfectly fine with this. They had traded R7 for Chopper, and C1 seemed like a perfectly calm droid. When Yularen confronted Anakin and Ahsoka about the two droids, they were baffled. They actually laughed a little, which he didn't appreciate a whole lot. But Ahsoka was taking to heart Anakin's words on Ryloth. The Republic Admiral could already feel his hair turning gray, and so instead of playing into their torment of him, he just accepted that his life must be torture, and he left the Jedi to their droids. Well, as it turns out, R2 and Chopper were brawling as Yularen said, because when the Jedi found their droids, they were commencing the greatest duel in Star Wars history. Like masters of the hand, they were slapping the other. Clanking of metal fists continued to sound off as the Jedi broke them up. Anakin demanded a meaning for all of this, and essentially it all bubbled down to the droids calling each other a wuss. That's it. There was also nothing founded in that. They were just insulting each other for the love of the game, and honestly, there was something to commend in that. Even though Chopper and R2 were digging at each other, they didn't actually want to destroy the other. This was like a middle ground between playing and trying to kill themselves. There was some hatred, but it wasn't like deep-seated. R2 was a family dog, Chopper was the family cat. Make of that what you will. One would always be devout and loyal. The other wants to see your downfall, just for pure amusement. The droids would always be by their side as they continue to move further into the Clone War. Ahsoka and Chopper actually bonded a lot following Ryloth, more so than R7A7 and her did. This was partially because of the personality. Even though R2 and R7 were more like dogs, Chopper's inclination to be a prick every day meant that if Ahsoka was sleeping in, he'd wake her up. This could be for either attention, because he thought it was funny, or because he thought she was being lazy. This was especially irritating when they weren't on deployment. Chopper was a big part of Ahsoka's training too, because his mere existence encouraged Anakin to put her through more hell. This could be through a number of ways, but most specifically, Anakin would equip Chopper with a taser, and the droid used it on her to either wake her up or to make her train. Like for example, when Anakin put Ahsoka into the Circle of Death to train against stun blaster rounds, he would also give Chopper dual-wielded blasters, and the droid would go gangsta on his owner. While it could get on her nerves, it was Chopper. How could you not love him? He couldn't do anything wrong. And that was the consensus Ahsoka frequently came to. She just couldn't stay mad at him. He really was her best friend, and even though Chopper beefed with R2 whenever they saw each other, Anakin didn't really care unless it interrupted something he was doing. Like the one time when R2 was helping Anakin work on a starship, and Chopper knocked into the back of R2, forcing the droid to whip around to smack his friend. In the process of whipping around to smack his friend, R2 knocked the entire toolkit off the ship onto Anakin's groin. Of course, Anakin reacted and slammed his face into the bottom of the ship. Not a great day for either of them. Or how about the one time that Chopper and R2 were chasing each other and ran over Obi-Wan's toe? That was a good day too. Skywalker and Tano, of course, got scolded because Kenobi knew better than to try and tell droids what to do. The initial timidness that Chopper had around the commanders faded because his personality choices were encouraged, though this didn't yet result in war crimes. These were basic pranks to ruin R2's day, specifically. In Chopper's mind, there could only be one Clanka, and it was him. A few months following Ryloth, Chopper and R2 would accidentally be involved in a siege. The two of them had accompanied Rex and the boys on some recon missions, though Anakin made a very important note to make sure they were split up for recon. So, for example, one squad got R2, the other got Chopper. Even though the droids understood when to be mature, no one wanted to risk it. Anyhow, this specific siege was the first true showing of the terrible twins' power. The Republic was blindsided by Ventress, and she was leading a group of battle droids against Skywalker. Dooku and Sidious planned this, so Anakin could be properly trained, and Ventress was the perfect tool for that. A duel would commence as thousands of battle droids attacked and encircled Republic fortifications on the ground. Rex and the boys lined the walls and artillery rocked the ground. Asajj would breach the walls and confront Anakin. His apprentice, or his pet, as Ventress referred to her as, was on the other side of the base. Chopper and R2 were doing their own little thing, which, when the assault came, was minding their own business inside the command center. They watched the holomap as clone operators inside the base issued out orders to personnel to best repel the assault. The droids watched and saw the weakness in the flank, which is where Anakin and Ventress were fighting. In an effort to assist, they waddled out of the command center. By the time they got there, a number of commando droids were breaking through the clone lines and making a push for the door operations to let the rest of the droid army in, which would pretty much destroy the base. Even if the clones won, they would lose the fort. R2 and Chopper recognized this immediately, so by using some canisters near artillery, they took a transport and rolled it towards the front bay. They were giggling in their own satanic ways when they did this. Anakin saw it from the corner of his eye, but he didn't realize what they were doing. By the time the doors were opened by the commando droids, the first wave of B-2 battle droids started to ascend the ramp into the base. The two astromechs dropped the payload, and thousands of pounds of explosive shells bounced down the ramp. Not the smartest idea, but they didn't explode, they just collided with the droids and rolled over them, stopping just outside the base. Chopper and R2 looked to each other, disappointed in the lack of explosion. But Chopper pulled out what could best be described as a Molotov cocktail without the liquor, and he held it in front of R2, who lit the fuse. Chopper knocked the bottom of the device and it bounced forward, sizzling towards the battle droid line and colliding with the explosive shells, sending an explosive fire into the air. The two droids alone at the top of the ramp laughed in triumph. Choppenheimer was born. They watched hundreds of battle droids burn alive, and they celebrated. Thanks to the shields around the wall of the fort, the base didn't get destroyed, but this would save the entire base and result in the near capture of Asajj Ventress. It was a victorious day, by accident as it appeared, until security footage showed the two monsters having a monster mash. They were celebrated for protecting the base, and presumably saving everyone's lives. Anakin and Ahsoka, though, had other ideas as a result of this success. Since war crimes were their way of conducting battle, then why not use these droids to further advance their capabilities? They had obviously seen Chopper or R2 do something cool here or there, but the fact that they were able to destroy the entire droid force on that flank in one go was remarkable. That wasn't an accident, it was a consolidated effort, so Snips and Skyguy started brainstorming up ways to most efficiently use their droids for crimes against humanity. Well, while Anakin and his apprentice were thinking about the most effective uses of their menaces, the CIS was learning about these droids. Dooku, despite playing the part for the war, was still technically a faction leader, and he took orders and information. Ventress returned with intel on these two droids following the battle. This wasn't the first time a Republic astromech came to their attention. For example, Grievous was partially responsible for stealing R2-D2 earlier in the war, but this was different. The Separatists had just purchased R2 off a salvage scrapper, someone who didn't really matter, just making a quick buck off the war. Going after two droids specifically, under the protection of Skywalker and Tano, was a completely different story. This entailed a lot more schematics that Dooku wasn't sure if he was willing to use to get astromechs, but Ventress was very adamant that it could help them capture Skywalker. So he said what the hell, and told her to get a team together to capture the droids. The worst part, this entire operation would be a failure. It wouldn't be until the long drawn out plan for Kamino that something for these two droids would get started. As a note, the previous mission mentioned, Ventress sent an entire squad of commandos to capture them, and the battle droids did capture the astromechs, but that lasted until R2 ignited them on fire and Chopper stole one of the vibroblades and started weaving it around. Even though they weren't changing the war per se, they were still on a hit list for the Separatists. On Kamino, the astromechs would be targeted again. The split assault containing Grievous and Ventress would go pretty averagely. Ahsoka and Anakin were in the space battle, while Kenobi fought on the surface. R2 and Chopper, of course, in the astromech slots for their starships. Ahsoka also was at Kamino because she never went on the mission with Padme to do diplomatic things. The battle was very intense early on, but when Kenobi noticed the change on the surface of Kamino, then of course the coming land invasion, he requested for Ahsoka and Anakin to return. By the time they landed, the assault would be underway. Asajj and Anakin would have a rematch, as Grievous and Kenobi had their own duel to duke out. Ahsoka was left in charge of the defenses, and assisting the ARC troopers on the front lines. She was a hardened commander at this point, but what evaded her were her droids. Chopper and R2 had other plans. Since the Separatist fleet was tearing itself apart, they used one of the Kaminoan pods to escape the battle on the surface. Unbeknownst to them, it was within the Separatist strategy to prepare to intercept a Kaminoan pod if the ground assault failed. So without needing credentials, because the droids assumed Grievous and or Asajj were retreating to the fleet, the two droids were able to enter the flagship undetected. They fought each other down the ramp of the Kaminoan pod and entered the hangar bay of the flagship. They went pretty undetected too, because the droids weren't currently searching for intruders. R2 and Chop, though, had the idea to make the boom boom go boom boom. They rolled through the halls of the ship before knocking down a couple of guard droids near the reactor. Chopper stole two weapons and bobbed along behind R2 with joy. When they entered the reactor room, they quickly plugged in and retrieved a detonation device code. Only problem, the trigger was only accessible inside the bridge of the ship. The two droids with dual weapon wielding Chopper made their move. What they didn't know is that on the surface, another Kaminoan pod was racing out of the atmosphere. Grievous and Ventress had failed, and they were ordering the full-blown retreat from the planet. The space battle was still taking place, with the Republic fleet holding its own against the larger Separatist invasion force. R2 and Chopper wheeled into the bridge, and Chopper said some obscenities about the droids, before pulverizing the tactical droid and a few of his guards. R2 quickly grabbed the detonation device, and they escaped. By the time they got to the hangar bay, Ventress was pulling into the flagship. It was a little weird. Ventress and Grievous looked out their window, and R2 and Chopper looked out theirs, as Chopper said something audible only to R2. They then throttled away from the vessel, and the two droids tapped their mechanisms against the button. Nothing happened. Another couple obscenities were shared before their vessel was knocked off of course, when an explosion shredded through the droid flagship, killing Ventress and Grievous and vaporizing the rest of the Separatist fleet. Since the vessel had been disabled, they spun in circles, smashing into the sides of the ship before stopping and looking at their destruction. They had done it. They had just won the Battle of Kamino, another war crime to add to their reputation. Of course, they would need to be celebrated on Coruscant and inside the temple for their work to destroy the Separatists. Chopper did suggest pantsing Yoda, but R2 discouraged it. Another war crime could wait for now. Today was their day to celebrate. Oh, and if I told you that Sidious was pissed off, would you believe it? He didn't even know how to conceptualize how two droids rampaged through a fleet, killing two of the top generals in the Separatist military. Tyrannus promised to make things right. The droids had been brought to his attention, but now it was time to be sincere in ripping them up and selling them to the nearest junk trader. The Jedi Council, inversely, continued to be impressed with the success Ahsoka and Anakin had on their missions. The droids were seriously a fantastic addition to their squad. The destruction of Grievous, though, had the Senate clinging onto a hope that they could end the war without having to request additional troops. The Separatists were even more concerned because their lead general had been killed, and Admiral Chench hadn't somehow returned to combat, despite surviving an explosion to the face. Because Chopper and R2 were on Coruscant, away from deployment, they were encouraged and accompanied by Ahsoka to get some fresh air. Coruscant's controlled weather systems meant it was a pretty luxurious planet to live on if you lived on the top half of the planet, basically the sunlight. Ahsoka needed to be away from combat, and the droids needed to enjoy their victory. They of course enjoyed it in their way. Ahsoka would get a couple ugly looks because she let her droids run over people's feet. A stroller almost got clobbered, but luckily for that child, the droids were separated before colliding. In the meantime, while they were enjoying the plaza outside the Senate chambers, there were some big changes being made. The Separatists, led by Mina Bontiri, realized that the war wasn't going to last. They were doing well, but the loss over Kamino was as clear a sign as ever that no matter the numbers of the droids they had, they couldn't win. Kamino at this point in the war was like a miniature version of the Battle of Coruscant at the end of it. It was a big time risk, a big time loss, and it came accompanied by the loss of the Separatist general. Grievous was their military leader, because no one saw Dooku as that individual. The Confederacy realized that this was their chance to throw in the hat before they went too deep into debt or faced more scrutiny from the Republic in a post-war that ended later than now. The Separatists proposed their treaty and it surprised the Senate, but they were just eager to end the war. Palpatine, without full power over the Senate, had to let them make their own choices, and because they had limited time to prepare, Dooku couldn't get his crew of transforming bombing droids to Coruscant to destroy the power grid. Instead, in almost the blink of an eye, the Clone War came to an end. This was quite anticlimactic, and the Sith knew that. Sidious and Tyrannus in any other circumstance would have had the ability to stop this, but it was blindsiding for both of them. Dooku had plans, but Palpatine decided against them. They would do something else. Instead of waging a war from a political standpoint, because Palpatine would be forced to lose executive power in the peace treaty, they would wage war the traditional way. This gave them the chance to mount their forces, stash their credits, and disavow any loyalty to a system other than the Sith. Tyrannus wasn't fully on board with this, but he honestly didn't have a better choice to get what he wanted. This was the best way to give the galaxy a fresh start. He was 11 years into the Sith game. He couldn't just act like he did that for fun. He needed to fully commit. So the next phase of their Sith master plan began. Palpatine and Dooku wouldn't wage war on the galaxy for almost half a year. They wanted their assault to hit at the precise time when everyone's guard was down. In the meantime, the Jedi became regarded as heroes. The Senate rallied around peace bills and reimbursements for the clones, which included pensions and healthcare, and education so they could join the workforce after they finished their military terms. Ahsoka returned to her regular regimental training, and Skywalker got to be a Jedi Master without the conflict. As much as he enjoyed the thrills of battle, he preferred the serenity this brought him. Also, being that they were on Coruscant the entire time, he was allowed to sneak off and visit Padme every day pretty much. Chopper and R2 as well stayed inside the temple. Instead of terrorizing each other, they went for other astromechs, for fun. Yularen was also having the time of his life. No more Jedi, no more droids, just troopers who followed command. He enjoyed what he thought would be the enjoyment of his career for all of 6 months, before those same Jedi, those same droids, and the same war started up again. Ironically, Palpatine was still Chancellor when the quote-unquote unaligned battle droids attacked the galaxy. This was an effective way for the Sith to avoid any other bureaucracy. This was a return to the classic way of the Sith. They took over every major conglomerate, killed all their unnecessary staff, like board members, and utilized their labor force fairly to continue building their armies. The droid army still outweighed the strength of the clones, and the Sith knew that. When the first battle happened, everyone in the Republic blamed the CIS, but everyone in the former CIS pointed fingers at each other, until after the second assault, which hit another Republic world, confirming that the CIS wasn't behind this. The former Separatists went through extensive processes to retrieve representation. Most of this was accomplished prior to the first assault. The Jedi and clones would return to action and send forces to the Outer Rim to stop the rising unaligned Sith unit. No one knew they were going to war against the Sith, but this information would soon be revealed when a Jedi fleet would be destroyed and the death of Eth Koth at the hands of Sidious would be sent across the galaxy. For Palpatine and Dooku, they could finally enjoy being Sith. It was almost like euphoric, striking fear into the hearts of the Republic, and more specifically, the Jedi Order. Anakin and Ahsoka with the 501st were already en route to combat when this message was sent back. Windu, in fear for their lives, requested that they retreat once they made landing, but of course, stubborn Skywalker wouldn't listen to these orders. The 501st was also much larger at this point, so in fairness to both sides, they had something to their point. Windu worried about the Sith Lord entering Skywalker's ship and killing him. Anakin figured that the individual wouldn't even make it to his ship. A massive fleet sat under his helm, and, of course, the secret weapons. Well, their first battle would not be the success he thought it would be, but it would lead to other, more important information. For example, the new location of the Sith headquarters. Sidious and Tyrannus were looking for a new world to call their own. Instead of returning to boring old Korriban, they were terraforming Christophsis into a desolate wasteland. The souls of the local population were being harvested to make the planet's core impure, essentially turning Christophsis into the ultimate anti-planet, basically Korriban, a system that only the Sith could exist on, basically. This did mean that Tyrannus needed to further his understanding and practice of the dark side, though. Even with the 501st losing the aforementioned battle, which included losing some Venators, they were still supplied enough to make another push. Due to the vast size of the Sith military, they were able to disperse their fleets far and wide. At Christophsis, Admiral Trench was protecting the planet from attack, even though realistically, no one should know of their location. The only reason Skywalker heard was because the astromechs intercepted a transmission from a Caedonamodian captain to the rest of the fleet to regroup with Trench at Christophsis for further orders, after they forced the Republic to rout. That was the previous battle. Skywalker informed the Jedi Council about this, and as they were sending their own forces out into the galaxy to fight back the Sith, they discouraged Anakin from going to Christophsis. However, in expecting Anakin to break protocol, they sent Windu in as reinforcements. When the 501st arrived at a hyperspace, the fighter assault began immediately. Having nearly lost to Trench twice, Yularen was here for redemption. This was his chance to win the war against his arch-nemesis. Trench didn't even know who he was. R2 with Anakin and Chopper with Ahsoka sped out the main Venator, aided by their own troops. They flew towards the combat zone and entered an intense dogfight. Skywalker and Tano led two different squadrons in the varying directions, to give them room for the Y-Wing bombers to assault the Sith fleet. Y-Wings were prepared and slipped through the dogfight, and laid heavy ordnance onto the flagship. Yularen's damaged fleet was equal in size to the Separatists, and he moved forward. The Venators may have been a little weaker due to the previous battle, but they could win if they focused everything on the commanding ship. It was a move that Trench didn't expect. Trench ordered respective battleships to counter, but Republic corvettes under the cover of our Quentin's cruisers were able to distract the droid gunners. These corvettes were both a distraction and a counter. Their turbo cannons blasted through vulture droids, while the ships themselves were fast enough to avoid heavy turbo lasers from crushing through their weak shields. Anakin and Ahsoka were quick to move around the fleet. Chopper continued to yell at the vulture droids as Ahsoka blasted them to pieces. Anakin, once the battle got comfortable enough, sped through the atmosphere to investigate the surface. By this point, the planet was pretty much terraformed. It didn't take a lot, because battle droids were able to round up the entire population, and Sidious, in the 6 months prior to the new war, had Tyrannus retrieve an ancient Sith relic to aid them. The planet's population was completely killed off, and thousands of battle droids worked on erecting a new Sith temple. Because of the terraform and the population sacrifice, the Sith temple was constructed over a gaping hole on the planet, one that led straight down to the core. Anakin identified this, and he relayed the information to Ahsoka, who got it back to Yularen, but Ahsoka's ship was clipped and slammed into the hangar bay of a Separatist battleship. Ahsoka was knocked out cold, and Chopper quickly put the fire out before breaking the glass in the cockpit so Ahsoka could breathe. He tapped her head a couple of times and got worried. Despite being an intergalactic war criminal, his person was in danger. Chopper got off the ship and wheeled around. He knew the truth about the Sith planet, and he was trying to think of how to destroy the enemy and how to save Ahsoka. Well, Yularen was also in trouble. Luckily, because he moved the fleet in so aggressively, he was attacked from the rear. The benefit of moving his fleet in is that the massive, largest Sith fleet in the galaxy was just out of range with their long cannons. Had the Republic stayed where they were when they entered Christophsis space, they would have been pulverized. Anakin looked through another dogfight and searched for Ahsoka's vessel, as Yularen told him they needed to get out of here. Just as Anakin agreed, Chopper broke through and warbled through an idea. Thanks to Anakin relaying information to Ahsoka earlier, Chopper demanded for Anakin to get into a specific battleship to help him. Yularen wouldn't listen to a damn bucket on a normal day, but with a crumbling Sith fleet in front of him and the massive one behind him, he had no other choice. Sidious and Tyrannus from the surface watched the sky erupt into fire, but they knew that Trench's force would find victory. They just didn't know yet that Admiral Trench had already died. Yularen repositioned his fleet, moving hard to the starboard side of the flank, skipping past the still remaining defense force. This did expose them a bit, but it also allowed them to maintain a fighting retreat. At the same time, Skywalker jumped out of his vessel and found Ahsoka. She was still unconscious from the crash. R2 and Chopper wheeled away from the hangar bay, while Anakin wasn't looking. An LAAT from the flagship was able to rescue them, when Anakin realized the droids were missing. But Chopper and R2 were doing something very important. In a similar fashion to their work over Kamino, they blitzed the bridge, but this time they actually full-on attacked it. Using their rocket boosters, they knocked over control droids, and Chopper even got himself a blaster to use against the battle droids inside the bridge. Once they were cleared out, they warbled commands to each other, simple little whistles and calls. Chopper was very adamant that they make this work. With Yularen actually listening to a droid for once, the Sith fleet, the largest one of the galaxy, closed in after the Republic, and the ship they had just taken over turned around and dove towards the planet's core. Without escape pods, R2 knew what his friend was suggesting. They were ending it all with their best friend. Chopper and R2, once they got the ship into the atmosphere, knew they were without transportation, because Separatist ships didn't need escape pods. So they got into the middle of the bridge and held hands. The vessel cruised down through the atmosphere and towards the Sith Temple, one final blow to end the war. Even though Sidious and Tyrannus were constructing themselves a new haven, it was just scaffolding projects at this point. Nothing would stop a ship going through at the fastest speed it could inside the atmosphere. R2 and Chopper watched in great success, one final war crime to end it all, a retreat turned detonation of a planet. Yularen didn't technically need to know that, but he'd be in position to make a jump to hyperspace when the planet exploded. Just as they saw the Sith Temple, they leveled everything on the inside, and then the door behind them opened. Anakin told them to stop being dramatic and get out of here. They were confused and followed him. There was a Separatist shuttle in the hangar bay that they could use. R2 and Chopper used their rocket boosters to zoom them through the corridors, and Anakin at the last moment flipped the shuttle out of the hangar bay, and the starship smashed through the scaffolding, blocking the entrance to the planetary core, and then fire erupted as the planet slowly split apart. Admittedly, the Sith weren't smart for opening up the planetary core, but to their fairness, they were terraforming. It wouldn't stay open like that forever, especially once the temple was finished, but that wasn't of any concern now. Skywalker told Yularen to leave and jump to hyperspace. He then told the droids to ready the coordinates, and Chopper let R2 have the honors. Being a bitch. Got him. The ship jumped to hyperspace once R2 heard Chopper call him that. The droids of course would have their own monster mash, but their actions had just saved the galaxy for the time being. The remnants of Christophsis, her people and her culture, would swallow the Sith whole and destroy the massive fleet chasing Yularen. It would be a day of reckoning for the galaxy, one in which they banded together to make sure the Sith never returned again. But the Sith had basically done the job for the people of the galaxy. In the destruction of their new planet was also the complete dismantling of any other organization with power or financial credits to challenge the Republic. Because Dooku and Sidious removed the unnecessary members from every conglomerate with military resources used by the Sith, there was no one but worker bees to try and do anything. The Republic would seize all their assets, basically the Trade Federation, Techno-Union, and so on. And then, following, the two droid heroes from Kamino would be recognized again for their valor, again. Yularen had to at least admit once in his life that these two droids weren't so bad. The war with the still remaining Sith faction would take a couple months to finish up. Then legislation would start, and that'd be a field day for the Jedi Order, who had just proven how much of an existential threat the Sith really were. Ahsoka and Anakin wouldn't be involved. They'd be having ice cream with Chopper and R2, who were throwing sticks in front of cyclists, because they deserve it, and if you disagree, you're a heretic. Ahsoka would eventually become a Jedi Knight, and Skywalker a Master. The terrible twins, after being acknowledged for ending 2 wars, would never have their war crimes questioned. No questions for Choppenheimer. The 2 droids, though, after bringing peace to the galaxy and balance of the Force, would continue their generational beef with one another. R2 and Chopper continue to call each other a wuss for grabbing the other's hand in their final moments. They would never admit it, but even through all the excitements that Anakin's and Ahsoka's lives would bring them, the 2 droids were fully brothers who saved the galaxy. And that, my friends, is a whimsical, wholesome PP story, a WWPP. Special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Let's talk about the Choppenheimer. So, if you haven't been able to figure it out yet, Chopper is like my favorite droid in all of Star Wars. He is hilarious. I love him. Just look at him. He's so goofy and stupid, and I love him. This story, more than anything, is kind of a reflection of the previous one I did with Chopper and Anakin, though I wanted this one to focus more on the droid dynamic. I wanted this to be between Chopper and R2. That's why they're on the thumbnail. Chopper and R2 I feel like would have a generational beef, as you see in Rebels, but I think that their beef would be kind of just picking on each other. I think they'd be kind of like siblings, where they just kind of they love each other, but they want to kill the other. Chopper and R2 I think would accidentally win themselves the war. That is what they're basically doing. They're accidentaling themselves into every situation and kind of coming out on top. It's kind of the goofiness of it all, but that's kind of how both of them work. Chopper and R2 just kind of win for being themselves. Also, for the whole Sith thing, I thought it'd be fun to, despite the story being a bit more whimsical, have the Sith have a completely different plan, where they kind of just forego the whole Sith plan with bureaucracy and go traditional Sith. That's something I might cover in a future story, but I thought it'd be fun to use that here, just to explore more war crimes with Choppenheimer and R2 and Heimer. Anyways, hope you all enjoyed though. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, Gouda Gouda Gouda.